Hey everyone, welcome to Inverse Happy Hour. My name is Jake and I'm here with Carole Stivers. We're going to be talking about her new book, The Mother Code, and we also have a special reading from that book. So welcome, Carole. Thanks for joining
Hi.
us. How are you doing, with all things considered? Not too bad, I hope.
We're okay out here in California. I'm not so sure what's going on in New York right now, but
It's not as bad as
uh,
it sounds, at least
yeah.
if you're healthy. Yeah. But anyway, that's why we're doing these to, give people something else to think about, read about, and I think just talking about sci-fi in the future always is like a fun way to escape. So that's a good place to start. Um, what what do you think science fiction can offer at a time like this when the real world is not so great?
Uh, well, I'm I'm a little worried right now about my own book because it does
Mhm.
involve a pandemic,
Oh,
and I
boy.
didn't mean it to do that. Um, I had to figure out a way to kind of get rid of all life on Earth so that my story could
Sure.
transpire. And so I created something that was much worse than a virus. Actually, it's not a virus, although a lot of people uh, online I notice are saying it's a virus. It's not a virus. It's a bit of DNA, which is very malicious and it's used as a bioweapon.
Interesting.
And so I think the thing that I think I noticed that a lot of readers who are reading it, say on Goodreads or whatever, they're really freaked out and they say I couldn't finish it, things like that. It's very upsetting, and I didn't mean it. Who knew? I just
Of
didn't know
course.
that anything like this was going to happen. But I think that in my case, I think the parallel that I see between what happens in my book and what is happening now in real life, at least in my own life, is the isolation of the characters. They can't go outdoors anymore because basically in this case, um, Earth's air contains something that they literally cannot breathe. And it's much worse than, I can go out, I take a hike. I took a hike
Sure.
yesterday. um, but it's that isolation, it's that feeling of being closed in. And I think after about maybe 2-3 weeks of this is when it really hit me, like how um, almost claustrophobic my life was becoming.
Yeah.
Even though I'm here with my husband and daughter, it's I can only imagine what it's like to be living alone right now and not be able to get out and see anyone.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
Totally.
I'm not sure if I
Yeah.
answered your questions, but
That's
I think the sci-fi in general for me
sure. Yeah.
has always been a way to look at people in extreme situations
Hmm.
and whether or not what would they do. I like that uh, you can put people in really crazy situations and then watch what they do. And
Hmm.
so that's for me what the draw of sci-fi has always been. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, in general. Yeah.
So you've just sort of talked a bit about the book. I'd love to get a bit more of the background, the story, and just sort of what inspired you to write this book and this particular story.
Oh, well, so I kind of resigned from my last job in 2003, my last full-time
Mhm.
job. I used to work in medical diagnostics, and
Yeah.
I kind of know way too much about things like what happened in bad blood and things like that. But so I resigned from the job in 2003. We went on a trip, which was involved driving across the desert,
Mm.
and I saw this truck along the side of the road that had I don't know if you're familiar with a Cadillac Ranch in Texas, but it was kind of like that. Somebody had like driven this truck into this ravine, and it was just like sticking up out of the ground with its rear wheels up like this. And I thought, wow, that looks godforsaken. I mean, the whole terrain we were driving across looked so godforsaken, and I thought this would be what it would be like after an apocalypse, basically. Um, and my mind started turning, and I had thought that when I stopped working, that I might take up creative writing.
Oh.
I never did it before, really,
Mhm.
and so I got this idea in my head that it went through many iterations. I think I have drawings and thoughts about this going back to 2004. Um, and then over the years, it kind of evolved as I was taking writing classes and going to writing meetups and meeting other writers and things. And it just kind of evolved into the story that it kind of is. And I like these, the Mecca, the
Oh,
idea of a Mecca,
big robot.
yeah, and Pacific Rim and things like that, where
Yeah.
someone can inhabit a machine and actually the machine melds with their mind. And so that kind of stuck in my mind. And I also like the idea of being able to use AI to prolong the life of a mind. So, which is something that happens in my book.
Interesting.
Because people can't prolong their own lives, they prolong the life of their minds so that they can then bring up children in a way that is human, so that they have someone to relate to. Yeah,
Sounds
a
like you're
lot of different.
tackling a lot of cool sci-fi ideas in this
Yeah.
book. Uh, I am curious about that. So, do you have any advice for someone in a situation like yours where, you have a career and then you maybe decide at some point, oh, I want to write a book. What advice would you give someone who's trying to make that kind of shift? Besides, I guess, take
Well,
classes, or would you recommend it?
yeah, in my case, I was really lucky. I got into a couple of these juried writing retreats, and then you get to meet agents, you get to meet editors. And I met the editor that I had in one of the writing retreats. I went to the Northern California writing retreat out here, which is, at the time, it was the very first one they ever had. And it's very small and very intimate, only 12 people. And the woman running it said, oh, I wouldn't mind editing that book of yours. And so she knew people. I think, you have to know people who know people. And so once you get somebody who believes in it, who knows someone, and then they know someone, and then they know someone. And my agent is not someone who does science fiction. Um, her assistant is probably much more conversant with science fiction than she is.
Sure.
So I was really surprised that she wanted to represent it. I actually met her at another writer's retreat.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's a first for her. I'm not sure she's going to do more science fiction after this, but it's just something. And then she knew someone in Hollywood, and that person loved it. And, that's how it's knowing people. And I'd heard that
Sure.
before, and I think it's true in every walk of life.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
I did want to ask also, so I know you were a doctor, and I think I read that you have like a background in biochemistry. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what kind of, it sounds like this book talks a lot about like modifications on the human. What kind of genetic modifications do you think would help us survive as a human race?
Oh boy. Uh,
That's a big question.
Make us smarter. I mean, I was listening to
Sure.
John Scalzi's thing the other day, and I just thought, get a clue, about the Earth. I'm sorry, but it's just like, get a clue. And I'm sorry, I think anything that would make people, okay, I just finished a book called the is it How to Change Your Mind by uh, Michael Pollan. I just love his stuff. And so it was talking about psychedelic research, basically. But the idea that, psychedelics are supposed to cause us to kind of lose our ego and think more universally and think about ourselves as part of a larger universe. And I think, okay, if I was to say what kind of mutation could happen in humans that would make them more adaptable, I would think it would be something like that, where we just are able to drop our egos a little bit and then just relate to other humans and to our surroundings in a more holistic way. I think so. There, I figured it out.
That, I feel like that would fix a lot of problems. I think that's uh, what else? I wanted to ask also, I read in the summary, the sort of synopsis of your book, that this is described as a last resort, this like Mecca situation. Have you does the book talk about, or have you considered like, what's the first resort? Like, how many steps does humanity go through before we end up in this scenario that you've described, that you created?
Oh, okay. So the things that they run through, actually, I've been criticized a lot for it. There's a lot of science in there. Because I kind of was thinking about, okay, if laboratorians, and in this case, it's people at the BSL-4 facilities in Washington D.C. that are going through the scenarios. What would we do? And of course, first they try to come up with an antidote, right? And since it's not a virus, they can't give people a vaccine. They can't develop a vaccine. I had to make it that way. Otherwise, hey, we're done. Viruses pretty much will burn themselves out, thank God, and most of us will survive. So in this case, they had to come up with something that is, almost a genetic engineering on a global scale. They would have to be able to administer to every human on the earth something that would genetically engineer them to be resistant. And so the first thing they try is to design something that's just like the biowarfare agent, but it acts in contraversion of the biowarfare agent. And so, okay, now we poisoned everybody, and now we're going to unpoison everybody.
Yeah.
But it really is a long shot, and they really quickly run out of time, and so end up with this kind of last resort, which is, okay, well, we're not going to be around. It turns out they are around because their antidote works a little bit, enough that some of them survive, but they don't have time to make enough for everyone on Earth. And so you end up with this core group who really is still there, but most people are gone. And turns out that there's also people on Earth who are genetically not genetically different enough that they survive too. So there are little pockets. I was thinking about like Stephen King, The Stand, where you have these little pockets of people that you discover are still alive. But yeah, so it takes them about 2 years to realize they're running out of time, and then they have to switch to plan F or whatever.
That makes sense. Makes a lot of sense to me. So let's just, let me ask you one more question, which I've been asking everyone, and I'm curious to hear what you say, which is, do you have any books or movies or anything else that you've been using to occupy yourself right now that you'd recommend to people who are looking for something to read or just watch?
Oh, so I'm a crazy person for TV, and I've been Netflixing all over the place. I really loved Star Trek Picard much more than I thought I was going to.
Yeah.
So that one I just ate it up, and the other one is, of course, Westworld. And Westworld is something where every episode I have to watch it like 2 or 3 times so I can move on to the next one. But it's so rich and deep, and so those two have been my most
recent. New season of Westworld.
Yeah, the new one. And
what do you think?
I think the what I love about it is it's so different. Now we're in a totally different world, so they're creating all these new sets and scenes. And there's some episodes, of course, they go back into the old Westworld, but in general, I was kind of getting the second season, I thought, oh my gosh, how much more of this can I take? And I was glad when they kind of broke out of it and with the horsewoman of the apocalypse or whatever, and they broke out of that and they got into where they're at now. And I find myself always trying to guess, like, oh, what is I guess I read one article where they talk about the meanings of all the characters' names, Dolores and Caleb being kind of like this loyal, the loyal one. And yeah, it's really interesting if you get into the names. I just think I'm really amazed by the writing on that show, to tell you the truth. That's just me.
No, I'm enjoying it too. I cut you off. Is there anything else, any books or any movies that you wanted to mention?
Really, Groundhog Day. No.
Ooh, that's
I think
it feels very relevant right now, doesn't it?
Yes. I mean, it seems like every day I wake up and go, where am I? I was thinking, let's see, what's the most recent book I read that I really loved. I mean, I think it was the Michael Pollan one was the one that stuck out most recently for me, that I like a lot. I read a lot of nonfiction compared to fiction. And strangely, I don't read a whole lot of sci-fi, which is weird. I like Isabel Allende, and I like a lot of magical realism.
Oh, nice. I mean,
And
that's great.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Carole, for joining us on Inverse Happy Hour. And you can check out the Mother Code when it comes out on August 25th, hopefully. And
Yeah.
you can hear reading from that book right after this.
I'm Carole Stivers, and today I'll be reading to you from my debut novel, The Mother Code. The Mother Code begins in 2049 when a bioweapon gone awry puts the survival of the human race at risk. In response, children who are genetically engineered to survive the threat are placed in the care of large-scale robots. The story centers on a boy named Kai, but it also includes others of the children as well as a group of adult survivors who created them and are now trying to ensure their safety, if only from afar. This is the US version, which had been due to come out on May 5th, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the release has now been pushed back to August 25th. I also have here the UK version, quite stunning artwork there. And there's yet another version of the cover art coming out very soon in the Netherlands. One of the most exciting things for me has been to see all the great cover art inspired by my book. I'll be reading to you today from chapter 5. Until it got to my editor at Random House, this had always been chapter 1, and I think it best encapsulates the heart of the story. Kai could feel the morning heat spilling through Rosie's hatch cover, flooding his cocoon. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, his fingers touched the small bump on his forehead, the rough place where the chip was embedded just under the skin. Your chip is special, Rosie had told him. It is our bond. It was how they knew one another, she said. It was how she spoke to him, except during his speech lessons, she never used her audible voice. He reached out to touch the smooth surface of the hatch cover in front of him. Where his fingers made contact, the transparent surface became opaque. An image appeared, a group of men with sun-weathered skin, colorful woven robes draped over their stooped shoulders. Rosie had been teaching him a lesson about people who lived in the desert, a desert much like his, but on the other side of the earth and very long ago. The men in the image, Rosie said, were the keepers of the scrolls, ancient writings like those unearthed from the caves over 100 years before the epidemic. What's that? He asked, pointing to one of the men. Perched atop the man's forehead, a small box was supported by a thin leather strap. Rosie's familiar soft buzz and click filled his mind as she accessed the required information. These were called tefillin. Each contained 4 tiny scrolls on which were written passages taken from a book called the Torah. Beneath her console, her servo motors whirred gently. This book described a set of beliefs that they lived by. You teach me through my tefillin, Kai said, pointing to his own dusty forehead, the chip encased there. Are you my Torah? Rosie paused. She was thinking, compiling her answer as she often did when he asked a difficult question. No, she said. The information that I provide is based purely on fact. It's important to separate beliefs from facts. Withdrawing his hand from the screen, Kai watched the image disappear. He peered through the hatch cover, once more transparent. Outside, the familiar rock formations surrounding their encampment stood firm, their massive red fingers pointing skyward. They were strong like Rosie, undaunted by wind and heat. He had names for all of them. The red horse, the man with a big nose, the gorilla, and the father who balanced his plump, round rock baby forever on his giant knees. Rosie had taught him about how humans used to live. She was his mother. He supposed then that the rocks were his family, the guardians who, along with Rosie, had kept watch over him since the day of his birth. He pressed the latch to his left, the sun's heat assailing him as the hatch lid swung open. He scrambled down over Rosie's treads to reach the ground, coming face to face with his own reflection in the pocked mirror of her metallic surface. His skin was tanned and freckled, streaked with dust. A cloud of reddish-brown hair framed his head, and blue eyes twinkled from beneath heavy lashes. Somewhere, Rosie said, there were other children, others like him, but different. Rosie couldn't tell him how many there were now, but in the beginning there had been 50. When the time was right, they would find them. As Kai picked his way over the cracked earth to the top of a low rise, beads of sweat escaped the barrier of his brow. His mouth felt full of sand. He formed his palms into circles, makeshift binoculars through which to survey the lonely landscape. In the ethereal shimmer of distant mirages, he straining to see the faraway places he'd learned about on Rosie's screen. He could see the high mountains whose peaks were dusted with snow each winter, but they were black now, devoid of their blankets. "Can we go soon?" he signaled his mother. "I think I'm ready. If conditions allow, we may go today." Today? He'd sensed the day was coming. On their last trip to the supply depot, Rosie had pushed aside the giant boulders, pried open the heavy metal doors with her powerful arms, and removed the final case of provisions, the last of the emergency water bottles. In the evenings, when the hot sun dipped behind the rocks and their shadows grew long, she'd begun training him to find his own food. In a battered tin cup, he'd harvested dried grass seeds. He toasted them over a small fire, then mixed them with water, adding shreds of mouse or lizard meat to make a thin stew. He chewed on the tender flower stalks of the banana yucca, making sure to spare some for the sweet fruit he could harvest come fall. The people who had lived here long ago had subsisted on food like this. "You are 6 years of age," Rosie said. "The time has come to leave this place." "Where will we go?" "I do not know." "You don't?" His heart quickened at the thought that there was something his mother might not know. "The command is incomplete. It instructs us to leave. However, our destination is not defined." Kai stared down at Rosie's powerful form, waves of heat shimmering off her weathered flanks. His mind vibrated with a hum of her processors. "Then how do we know if we're going to the right place?" "There are 76 supply depots, each equipped with a condensation tower and weather station," she narrated. "But the other children, will we find them now?" She paused again, and he imagined electrons coursing through her nanocircuits, bits of information traversing all the parts of her mind that she'd so patiently explained to him. "This is possible," she replied at last. "There is a non-zero probability that others have survived." Excited, Kai skimmed down the rise to the shade of his mother. He'd seen the petroglyphs, diagrams left by ancient peoples on the high faces of the rocks. He would make a sign of his own. He scooped up a pile of cobalt blue stones, arranging them to form letters. "Kai, son of Rosie," he spelled. "I was here." As he carefully formed the words, he imagined another child squatting here in the dust, reading his message.